grand halls of Buckingham Palace had rarely felt this tense. Whispers moved faster than the footsteps of the attendants, sliding through corridors carved in history, slipping past portraits of monarchs who had once ruled with certainty and unchallenged authority. Something had shifted, something no one wanted to say aloud, yet everyone could feel in the tightening silence that filled the royal residence. On this particular morning, the palace was not preparing for celebration, nor mourning. It was preparing for an event that was meant to reinforce unity within the monarchy, a high-profile royal gathering involving diplomats, senior royals, carefully selected guests from across Europe. A symbolic evening meant to project stability. Behind the polished silverware and freshly arranged floral displays, an unexpected storm was forming. At the center of it all was Queen Camilla. According to palace insiders, preparations for her attendance had been proceeding as normal just days earlier. Her schedule had been confirmed, her wardrobe selections finalized, and security arrangements quietly coordinated with precision. Everything suggested she would be present, seated prominently beside King Charles as expected. Yet in the span of a single afternoon, everything changed. It began with an emergency closed-door meeting in the palace's private wing. No official announcement was made, no press release followed. But those within earshot described a sudden flurry of activity. Assistants rushing between offices, senior advisors summoned without explanation, phones ringing in tones that carried urgency rather than routine. By evening, rumors began to circulate. Queen Camilla's name, once confidently printed on internal guest confirmations, had reportedly been removed. Not delayed, not adjusted, removed. And no one seemed willing to explain why. The first whispers pointed toward a dispute involving senior palace advisors and an undisclosed disagreement over the structure of the event itself. Some claimed it was about protocol, who would sit where, who would speak, and who would represent the crown in moments of diplomatic significance. Others suggested something deeper, a fracture not just of planning, but of trust. What made the situation even more unsettling was the silence from King Charles. Known for his carefully measured communication and deliberate public appearances, the king offered no immediate clarification. Instead, his schedule was quietly reshuffled. 2 private engagements were postponed without explanation, and his presence at the upcoming event was suddenly listed as under review. For royal watchers and insiders alike, that phrase carried weight. Under review was never casual. It was a phrase used only when decisions were still being negotiated behind closed doors. And at the heart of those negotiations, according to speculation, was the question of Camilla's role. Inside the palace, tensions reportedly escalated when a disagreement emerged between senior household advisors. One faction insisted that Camilla's presence was essential, not just symbolic, but stabilizing. Another faction, however, allegedly raised concerns about optics, timing, and public perception following recent controversies that had already placed the monarchy under scrutiny. The details remain unconfirmed, but what followed was undeniable. Camilla was no longer listed as attending. By the following morning, the news had begun to leak beyond palace walls. Journalists stationed outside Buckingham Palace noticed unusual restraint from official spokespeople. Questions about the guest list were met with vague responses. Requests for confirmation were redirected. And then came the most telling sign of all, complete refusal to comment on Queen Camilla's status. In royal reporting, silence often speaks louder than statements. Within hours, headlines began to form. Expected royal shift, some read. Others hinted at internal palace disagreement, but none carried confirmation, only suspicion. Meanwhile, inside the palace, sources described a tense and highly controlled atmosphere. Camilla, according to these accounts, was informed privately rather than publicly. The conversation allegedly took place behind closed doors, in a room known for hosting sensitive discussions, far from cameras, far from staff, and far from anything that could leak immediately. What was said in that room remains unknown. But shortly after, Camilla was seen leaving a private wing of the palace earlier than scheduled, accompanied by a small security detail. Observers noted that her expression was composed, but noticeably restrained. No public appearance followed that day, and no official engagements were listed on her calendar for the remainder of the week. Speculation intensified. Some royal commentators suggested this could be a strategic withdrawal, a temporary step back designed to de-escalate tensions within the palace hierarchy. Others believed it signaled a deeper disagreement, one that might not be easily resolved behind closed doors. Absence of clarity only fueled the intrigue. Meanwhile, King Charles remained at the center of growing questions. His silence, deliberate as it may have been, became its own statement. Those familiar with royal protocol noted that such decisions are rarely made unilaterally. Even when final authority rests with the monarch, the process often involves layers of consultation, advice, and careful negotiation. So the question that began circulating was not just why Camilla was blocked, but who influenced the decision. Outside the palace gates, crowds gathered as journalists pressed for answers. Cameras flashed continuously, capturing every arrival and departure, searching for meaning in every movement. The monarchy, long accustomed to scrutiny, found itself once again under a magnifying glass it could not easily step away from. Inside, atmosphere reportedly grew more strained as the event drew closer. Preparations continued, but something fundamental had shifted. Conversations were quieter, decisions were delayed. Even the usually precise rhythm of royal coordination appeared unsettled. Then came the most startling development yet. A revised guest list was circulated internally, and once again, Camilla's name did not appear. This time there was no ambiguity, no under review status, no conditional wording, just absence. For some within the palace, this was interpreted as final. For others, it raised even more questions than it answered, because in royal tradition, removals of this nature are not taken lightly. They often signal either a significant internal disagreement or a carefully managed recalibration of roles and presence within the monarchy, and yet no official explanation followed. As the day drew to a close, the palace lights remained on longer than usual. Staff moved through corridors with measured urgency. Conversations stopped abruptly when approached. Somewhere within those historic walls, decisions were still being made that would determine how the monarchy would present itself to the world. But outside, only one story was taking shape. Queen Camilla had been blocked from a major royal event, and no one was willing to say why. The silence, more than anything else, had become the loudest part of the entire unfolding drama. And as night settled over Buckingham Palace, one question hung heavily in the air. What was really happening inside the royal household? And why had it reached a point where even the Queen herself was no longer guaranteed a place at the table? Uncertainty that had settled over Buckingham Palace did not ease with the passing hours. If anything, it deepened. By the following morning, atmosphere inside the royal household had become noticeably more restrained. Staff who usually moved with quiet confidence now appeared cautious, as though every corridor carried the weight of unspoken instructions. Conversations were shortened, doors were closed a little faster. Even the most routine exchanges carried an unusual heaviness. The revised guest list had done more than remove a name. It had altered the balance of expectation within the institution itself, and still no official explanation came. Outside the palace gates, the media pressure intensified. Cameras remained fixed on every entrance, hoping for a glimpse of movement that might suggest a reversal or clarification. Journalists pressed aides for answers, but the responses remained carefully neutral, repeating only that arrangements for the event are being finalized. That phrase, vague as it was, did little to calm speculation. Instead, it reinforced the idea that decisions were still being negotiated behind closed doors. Inside those closed doors, the situation was reportedly far from simple. Multiple accounts from palace insiders described a series of tense discussions involving senior advisors, communications officials, and members of the household's inner coordination team. At the center of the debate was not only Camilla's attendance, but the broader question of how the monarchy should present itself during an increasingly sensitive political and public moment. Some argued that excluding Camilla would create an unnecessary image of division. Others insisted that including her under current circumstances risked overshadowing the event entirely, shifting attention away from diplomacy and toward internal dynamics. What made the disagreement more complex was the absence of a unified voice from the top. King Charles, according to those familiar with the situation, remained deeply involved but unusually reserved in public expression. His decisions, when they came, were described as measured rather than immediate, carefully weighed rather than swiftly delivered. But even within that controlled approach, something had clearly shifted, because for the first time in recent memory, a major royal event was proceeding without absolute clarity on the Queen Consort's role. As the day of the event approached, another development emerged that added further tension to the situation. A second internal briefing was circulated, this time outlining revised seating arrangements and protocol expectations. In this version, senior positions at the event were redistributed, with certain roles reassigned to other members of the royal family and official representatives. Camilla's designated position was not reassigned. It was simply absent. That detail, more than anything else, fueled the growing belief that her exclusion was not accidental or temporary, but deliberate and structured. Royal analysts quickly began to interpret the move as a signal of deeper recalibration within the palace hierarchy. While public statements remained non-existent, patterns within internal arrangements suggested that adjustments were being made not just for a single event, but potentially for future appearances as well. Still, no one would confirm it. And then came the moment that shifted the tone of the entire situation again. On the evening before the event, a late-night convoy was seen leaving one of the palace wings under unusually tight security. Though official confirmation was never provided, multiple observers believed Queen Camilla was inside one of the vehicles. What caught attention was not the departure itself, but its timing and discretion. There was no public appearance, no accompanying statement, and no indication of her next engagement. For many, this raised a new interpretation, that she had not been publicly excluded in confrontation, but privately stepped back as part of a managed resolution. Yet even that theory failed to settle the matter, because within hours, conflicting reports began to emerge. Some sources insisted she was still in communication with senior aides regarding future roles. Others claimed she had been advised to remain away from the event entirely to prevent further distraction during sensitive diplomatic proceedings.